The sun was already beginning to scorch the dusty main street of Silver Creek when Hannah Johnson learned her fate had been decided without her consent. The 18-year-old stood frozen in her family's modest kitchen, the letter from her father trembling in her hands as she read the words that would change her life forever. "I cannot believe this," Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her mother's cooking. "Father has arranged for me to marry Mr. Prescott upon his return." Her mother, Eleanor Johnson, stopped stirring the stew and wiped her hands on her apron. The worry lines around her eyes deepened. "Your father believes it's for the best, Hannah. With the drought taking our crops and the bank threatening foreclosure, Mr. Prescott's offer seemed like providence." Hannah crumpled the letter in her fist. "Mr. Prescott is 42 years old, Mother. He's more than twice my age. He's a successful businessman with properties in 3 counties, Eleanor replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "He can provide security that's hard to come by in these parts." It was 1878, and life in the Arizona Territory was unforgiving. Hannah's father had traveled east to settle his brother's estate, leaving his wife and daughter to manage their struggling homestead. Before departing, he had apparently made arrangements with Emmett Prescott, Silver Creek's wealthiest resident and owner of the largest cattle operation in the territory. Hannah's golden brown hair fell from its pins as she paced the small kitchen. "I won't do it. I cannot marry a man I don't love, especially one old enough to be my father." "Hannah Jane Johnson," her mother said firmly, though her eyes were sympathetic. "Your father will return in 3 weeks, and Mr. Prescott has already begun preparations for the wedding. The entire town knows of the arrangement." "The entire town except me," Hannah replied bitterly. She stormed out of the kitchen and through the front door, needing air and space to think. The mid-June heat hit her like a physical force as she stepped onto the porch. In the distance, the mountains shimmered under the relentless sun, their purple peaks offering the only relief to the endless expanse of dusty browns and faded greens. Hannah grabbed her straw hat from the hook by the door and set off toward town. She needed to speak with Mr. Prescott herself. Perhaps she could reason with him, make him understand that a marriage without love would be a prison for them both. Silver Creek was a typical frontier town, one main street lined with wooden buildings, a church, a school, and businesses catering to the ranchers, miners, and travelers passing through. As Hannah walked purposefully down the boardwalk, she nodded politely to Mrs. Turner sweeping outside the general store and tipped her hat to the sheriff dozing in his chair. The Prescott Bank and Investment Company occupied the most imposing building in town, a 2-story brick structure with large windows and ornate trim. Hannah paused outside, gathering her courage before pushing through the heavy door. Inside, the air was noticeably cooler. A young clerk looked up from his ledger, surprise evident on his face at the sight of Hannah standing there alone. "Miss Johnson," he stammered, "how may I assist you today?" "I need to speak with Mr. Prescott," Hannah said, lifting her chin slightly. "It's a matter of some importance." "I'm afraid Mr. Prescott is in a meeting." With the door to the back office opened, and Emmett Prescott himself emerged, accompanied by a man Hannah had never seen before. Prescott was tall and broad-shouldered, with iron gray hair and a meticulously trimmed beard. Despite being in his 40s, he carried himself with the vigor of a younger man, the result of building his fortune through hard work before turning to more genteel business pursuits. "Miss Johnson," Prescott said, genuine pleasure in his voice. "What a delightful surprise. I was planning to call on you tomorrow." Hannah felt her resolve wavering under his genial demeanor, but steeled herself. "Mr. Prescott, I need to speak with you privately about a matter of great importance." Prescott glanced at his companion, a rugged man with trail dust still clinging to his clothes. "Jackson, we'll continue our discussion tomorrow. I believe Mr. Vance here has some cattle to inspect before making his decision anyway." The stranger, Mr. Vance, turned to look at Hannah directly for the first time. She found herself momentarily struck by the intensity of his gaze. He was younger than Prescott by at least 15 years, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling at the collar of his shirt, and a several-day growth of beard shadowed his jaw. "Madam," he said simply, touching the brim of his hat before turning to leave. Hannah couldn't help but notice how different he was from the town men she knew. There was something untamed about him, something that spoke of wide open spaces and freedom. "Please, come into my office," Prescott said, drawing her attention back. He gestured toward the open door and Hannah entered, her heart pounding. The office was handsomely appointed with a large oak desk, leather chairs, and bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. Maps of the territory covered one wall, with Prescott's extensive holdings marked in red. "Now then," Prescott said, closing the door and moving behind his desk. "What can I do for you, Miss Johnson?" Hannah took a deep breath. "Sir, I've received a letter from my father informing me of an arrangement between you." Prescott smiled benevolently. "Ah, yes, I had hoped to discuss this with you personally before your father's letter arrived." "Sometimes the mail moves faster than anticipated." "Mr. Prescott," Hannah said, forcing herself to meet his eyes, "I cannot marry you." His smile didn't falter, but something shifted in his gaze. "I understand this must seem sudden to you, my dear. But I assure you I have nothing but your best interests at heart. Your father and I have discussed this at length." "My best interests," Hannah repeated. "Sir, you are a kind and respected man, but I don't love you. I barely know you." Prescott leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "Love, Miss Johnson, is a luxury many cannot afford. What I offer is security, position, and comfort. Your family's farm is failing through no fault of your father's, I might add. The drought has been merciless. I can ensure you and your parents never want for anything again." Hannah felt tears threatening but blinked them away. "I appreciate your generosity, truly, but marriage should be based on more than financial arrangements." "Such romantic notions," Prescott said, not unkindly, "but the West is no place for starry-eyed dreamers. Life here requires practicality and fortitude. I believe you possess both." "Please," Hannah said, desperation creeping into her voice, "there must be another way to help my family." Prescott's expression hardened slightly. "Your father has already accepted my offer and the advance I provided. The arrangements are being made. I suggest you use these next few weeks to become accustomed to the idea." He stood, signaling the end of their conversation. "You'll find I can be a very generous husband, Hannah." She flinched at his use of her given name, feeling as though something had been taken from her without permission. Leaving the bank, Hannah felt numb. The afternoon heat had intensified, but she barely noticed as she walked blindly down the street, her mind racing with increasingly desperate thoughts. "Whoa there, miss." Hannah looked up just in time to avoid colliding with a horse. The rider, the same man from Prescott's office, had pulled his mount to a sudden stop. "I apologize," she said automatically. "I wasn't watching where I was going." "No harm done," he replied, dismounting in one fluid motion. Up close, she could see his eyes were actually blue-gray, like the sky before a storm. "Are you all right, Miss Johnson? You know my name," she said, surprised. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Small towns have big ears. Besides, Prescott mentioned it." He extended his hand. "Jake Vance." Hannah hesitated before shaking his hand. His palm was calloused and warm. "What brings you to Silver Creek, Mr. Vance?" "Looking to buy some cattle to start my own operation up north," he answered, "and getting a feel for the territory." Something about his presence made Hannah feel slightly less adrift. "How do you find it so far?" "Beautiful country," he said, glancing at the distant mountains. "Harsh but honest in its way." His eyes returned to her face. "I couldn't help but overhear part of your conversation with Prescott." Hannah stiffened. "It's not proper to eavesdrop, Mr. Vance." "Never claimed to be proper," he replied easily. "But I know trouble when I see it, and you, Miss Johnson, are in trouble." "It's nothing I can't handle," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Jake Vance studied her for a moment. "A woman being forced to marry a man she doesn't want, that's not something anyone should have to handle." "You don't understand," Hannah said. "My family's farm is failing. The bank, Mr. Prescott's bank, holds our mortgage if I don't." She couldn't finish the sentence. Jake's expression darkened. "I understand more than you might think." He glanced down the street toward the bank. How long before this wedding is supposed to take place? 3 weeks, when my father returns, Jake nodded thoughtfully. A lot can happen in 3 weeks. Before Hannah could ask what he meant, they were interrupted by the approach of her mother calling her name. I should go, Hannah said, feeling strangely reluctant to end their conversation. Jake touched his hat again. Miss Johnson, perhaps we'll speak again. Hannah hurried to meet her mother but couldn't resist glancing back at the tall cowboy who stood watching her, his horse's reins loosely held in one hand. Who was that man? Eleanor asked as they walked home together. A cattle buyer, Hannah replied, just passing through. That night, Hannah couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind churning with thoughts of Emmett Prescott and his unwanted proposal. Outside, an owl called mournfully, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered. The familiar sounds of the territory at night usually brought her comfort, but tonight they only reminded her of what she stood to lose: her freedom, her chance at true love, her very self. With a sigh, Hannah slipped out of bed and moved to the window. The moon hung full and bright over the landscape, bathing everything in silver light. In the distance, she could see the outline of the mountains, eternally vigilant sentinels guarding the horizon. How could she marry Emmett Prescott? The thought of being his wife, sharing his bed, bearing his children, it made her physically ill. Yet how could she refuse when her family's survival hung in the balance? The next morning dawned hot and clear, as most days did in the Arizona territory. Hannah helped her mother with the morning chores, feeding the chickens and collecting eggs, her movements mechanical as her mind continued to search for a way out of her predicament. Hannah, her mother said gently as they worked side by side in the garden, I know you're unhappy about your father's arrangement. Hannah yanked a weed from the ground with more force than necessary. It's not an arrangement, Mother, it's a sentence. Eleanor sighed. I married your father when I was 17. I barely knew him then. But did you love him? I grew to love him, Eleanor replied, and he has been a good husband, a good provider. Until now, Hannah said bitterly, her mother's face hardened. That's unfair. Your father has worked himself to the bone trying to keep this farm going through the worst drought in memory. He doesn't deserve your scorn. Shame washed over Hannah. I'm sorry, I know he's doing what he thinks is best. Mr. Prescott is respected in this community, Eleanor continued. He's never been known to be cruel or unfair. But he's so old, Mother, Eleanor almost smiled. 42 is hardly ancient, Hannah, and he's in good health. You could have many years together. Many years of what? Polite conversation over dinner. Living in that big house in town, away from the land I love. Hannah gestured to the open country around them. I don't want to be a banker's wife, entertaining ladies for tea and discussing the latest fashions from back east. There are worse fates, her mother said softly. Hannah knew she was right. Women in the West often faced harsh realities: poverty, violence, disease. A comfortable life with a respectable husband was more than many could hope for. But knowing this did nothing to reconcile her to the idea of marrying Emmett Prescott. Later that afternoon, Hannah rode into town to deliver eggs and butter to several regular customers. As she tied her mare to the hitching post outside the general store, she noticed Jake Vance emerging from the saloon across the street. He spotted her immediately and crossed over. Miss Johnson, he greeted her. Good afternoon, Mr. Vance, she replied, nodding politely. I've been thinking about your situation, he said without preamble. Hannah glanced around nervously. This isn't an appropriate topic for the middle of the street. Jake looked amused. Silver Creek doesn't strike me as a place overly concerned with Eastern proprieties. Nevertheless, Hannah insisted, I'd rather not discuss my personal affairs in public. Fair enough, Jake conceded. Would you permit me to walk with you while you complete your errands? Hannah hesitated. She barely knew this man, and associating with him might cause talk, but something about his steady gaze and quiet confidence made her trust him. Very well, she agreed. I need to deliver these to Mrs. Peterson and then stop at the mercantile. As they walked, Jake kept a respectful distance, though Hannah was acutely aware of his presence beside her. He was taller than most men in town, his stride long and easy, like a man accustomed to covering great distances. "Have you lived in Silver Creek all your life?" he asked. "Since I was 10, Hannah replied. "We moved here from Missouri after my father heard about the opportunities in the territory. And were there opportunities?" Hannah smiled ruefully. "For a time, the first few years were good, then the drought came." Jake nodded in understanding. "Nature has its own ideas about man's plans." "What about you?" Hannah asked. "Where are you from?" "Originally, Texas, but I've been moving around since the war ended. Worked cattle drives, broke horses, did some scouting for the army," he shrugged. "Never stayed in one place too long." "Until now," Hannah ventured. Jake gave her a sidelong glance. "Maybe, depends on what I find here worth staying for." They had reached Mrs. Peterson's house, and Hannah felt a strange reluctance to end their conversation. "I'll just be a moment," she said, leaving Jake waiting on the sidewalk while she delivered the butter and eggs. When she emerged, he was still there, hat in hand, watching her with those storm-colored eyes. "I've been thinking," he said as they continued toward the mercantile, "about Prescott's hold over your family." Hannah tensed. "It's a legitimate debt, Mr. Vance. My father borrowed the money in good faith." "I don't doubt that," Jake replied. "But there's something about the situation that doesn't sit right. How much does your family owe?" Hannah hesitated before answering. $500. It was for seed and equipment last spring, but when the crops failed." Jake whistled softly. "That's a substantial sum. But not so much that it should cost a woman her freedom." "What choice do I have?" Hannah asked, stopping to face him directly. "My family will lose everything." Jake's expression grew serious. "There's always a choice, Miss Johnson. Sometimes we just need help seeing it." Before Hannah could ask what he meant, a shout from down the street caught their attention. A wagon was careening out of control, its horses spooked by something and running at full gallop toward the main street. People scattered out of the way, pressing against buildings or ducking into doorways. Without hesitation, Jake sprinted toward the danger. Hannah watched in horror as he positioned himself in the path of the runaway team, his movements calm and deliberate despite the chaos around him. As the horses approached, Jake stood his ground, raising his arms and calling out in a clear, commanding voice. To Hannah's amazement, the horses began to slow, responding to his authoritative tone. When they were close enough, Jake lunged forward, grabbing the bridle of the lead horse and using his weight to turn the team, gradually bringing them to a halt. The wagon's driver, an elderly man Hannah recognized as Mr. Collins from the outlying farm, sat rigid with fear on the seat, his knuckles white where he gripped the useless reins. "You all right, old-timer?" Jake asked, breathing hard from the exertion. Mr. Collins nodded shakily. "Don't know what spooked him. One minute they were calm as can be, the next they were bolting like the devil himself was after them." A crowd had gathered, and murmurs of admiration rippled through it. Sheriff Daniels pushed his way forward. "That was some quick thinking, mister," he said to Jake. "Could have been a real tragedy if those horses had made it to the main crossing." Jake shrugged off the praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "Not just anyone could have stopped them," the sheriff countered. "You've got away with horses." Hannah approached, her heart still racing from the excitement. "Are you all right, Mr. Vance?" Jake turned to her with a grin that transformed his face, making him look younger and even more handsome. "Right as rain, Miss Johnson." Mr. Collins was helped down from the wagon, and several men volunteered to see to his horses. As the crowd dispersed, Emmett Prescott emerged from his bank, having witnessed the commotion. "Quite the display of heroism, Mr. Vance," he said, his tone pleasant but his eyes calculating. "Silver Creek is in your debt," Jake nodded curtly. "Just happened to be in the right place." Prescott's gaze shifted to Hannah and his expression softened. "Miss Johnson, I was hoping to speak with you." He glanced meaningfully at Jake. "Privately." Hannah felt trapped. "Of course, Mr. Prescott, I was just finishing my errands." "I'll wait for you," Jake said suddenly. "To escort you home." Prescott's smile tightened. "That won't be necessary. I'd be happy to see Miss Johnson safely back to her farm." "I've already agreed to accompany her," Jake replied, his tone friendly but firm. A tense moment passed between the two men. Hannah could feel the undercurrent of challenge flowing between them, though both maintained outward civility. "Very well," Prescott finally said. Perhaps we could speak tomorrow, Hannah. I'd like to show you some fabrics that arrived from San Francisco. I thought you might select something for your wedding gown. Hannah swallowed hard. That's very thoughtful. Until tomorrow then, Prescott said, tipping his hat before returning to the bank. As soon as he was out of earshot, Hannah turned to Jake. You didn't have to do that. Do what? Jake asked innocently. Offer to escort me home. Antagonize Mr. Prescott. Jake's expression grew serious. I didn't like the way he looked at you like you were already his property. In 3 weeks I will be, Hannah said, unable to keep the despair from her voice. Not if I have anything to say about it, Jake muttered, so quietly Hannah wasn't sure she'd heard him correctly. After Hannah completed her purchases at the mercantile, Jake retrieved her mare and his own horse, a magnificent buckskin stallion that stood at least 16 hands high. This is Thunder, Jake said as he untied the horse. Best partner a man could ask for. Hannah stroked the stallion's velvety nose. He's beautiful. They rode side by side out of town, following the winding dirt road that led to the Johnson farm. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape, and a gentle breeze had picked up, offering some relief from the day's heat. Your family's place is how far? Jake asked as they passed the last of the town buildings. About 3 miles, Hannah replied, just beyond that ridge. She pointed to a low rise ahead. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a bird the only sounds. Hannah found herself studying Jake's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, a habit of a man accustomed to watching for danger. You're staring, Miss Johnson, Jake said without looking at her, a hint of amusement in his voice. Hannah blushed. I was just wondering why you're taking such an interest in my predicament. We're strangers, after all. Jake was quiet for a moment, considering her question. My sister was in a similar situation once, he finally said, forced to marry a man she didn't love to save the family ranch. What happened? Hannah asked softly. She went through with it, Jake replied, his voice tight. Married a man 30 years her senior. He was cruel to her, broke her spirit. He paused, his hands tightening on the reins. She died in childbirth a year later. I'm so sorry, Hannah whispered. Jake shook his head. I was away when it happened, driving cattle up to Kansas. By the time I got back, it was too late. I swore then I'd never stand by and watch another woman forced into a marriage she didn't want. Hannah felt a lump form in her throat. Mr. Prescott isn't cruel, just persistent. Men like Prescott, Jake said, they're used to getting what they want. They don't take kindly to being refused. He turned to look at her directly. Be careful, Hannah. Men who use money as power rarely show their true nature until they've secured what they're after. They had reached the turnoff to the Johnson farm, a narrow track that wound through a stand of cottonwoods before opening onto the modest homestead. Hannah's mother was hanging laundry on the line and looked up in surprise at the sound of 2 horses approaching. Thank you for escorting me, Mr. Vance, Hannah said as they stopped in the yard. Jake dismounted and came around to help her down. His hands at her waist were strong and sure as he lifted her easily from the saddle. For a brief moment, they stood too close for propriety, and Hannah felt her heart quicken at his proximity. Hannah, her mother called, breaking the moment. Who's your friend? Hannah stepped back hastily. Mother, this is Mr. Jake Vance. He's in town looking to buy cattle. She turned to Jake. Mr. Vance, my mother, Alina Johnson. Jake tipped his hat respectfully. Madam, you have a fine daughter. Alina approached, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. Thank you. Will you stay for supper, Mr. Vance? It's simple fare, but there's plenty. Hannah was surprised by the invitation. Her mother was usually more reserved with strangers. I'd be honored, Mrs. Johnson, Jake replied with a warm smile that made him look even more handsome. Lena nodded. Hannah, show Mr. Vance where he can wash up while I finish with the laundry. As Hannah led Jake to the water pump at the side of the house, she couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and trepidation. There was something about Jake Vance that made her feel alive in a way she never had before. Yet getting too close to him could only lead to heartache. In 3 weeks, she would be Emmett Prescott's wife unless a miracle occurred. Over a simple supper of rabbit stew, cornbread, and fresh vegetables from the garden, Jake charmed Alina with stories of his travels and answered her questions about cattle prices and the conditions further north. Hannah found herself watching him, noting the way his hands moved as he spoke, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes when he smiled, the deep timbre of his laugh. "So, Mr. Vance," Alina said as they finished the meal, "what brings you to our part of the territory specifically?" "There are larger cattle operations in other areas." Jake glanced briefly at Hannah before answering. "I've heard good things about the grazing land north of here, and I was told Prescott has some prime breeding stock he might be willing to part with." "I see," Alina replied. "And how long do you plan to stay in Silver Creek?" "That depends," Jake said, his eyes meeting Hannah's across the table. "I might find reason to settle nearby." The implications of his words hung in the air between them. Hannah felt a blush rising to her cheeks and looked down at her plate. Alina, ever perceptive, glanced between them with a slight frown. "Hannah is engaged to be married to Mr. Prescott when her father returns," she said pointedly. "It's quite the match for our family." Jake's expression remained neutral. "So I've heard. Congratulations, Miss Johnson." Hannah couldn't bring herself to thank him for the felicitation she didn't want. After supper, as the sun began to set, Jake prepared to leave. Hannah walked with him to where Thunder was hitched, her mind racing with things she wanted to say but couldn't find the courage to voice. "Your mother is a fine woman," Jake said as he checked his saddle. "Strong." "Yes," Hannah agreed. "She's had to be." Jake turned to face her, his expression serious in the fading light. "Hannah, I meant what I said earlier. You shouldn't have to marry a man you don't love, especially to save your family's farm." "What choice do I have?" Hannah repeated her earlier question, desperation creeping into her voice. "We can't pay the debt. If I refuse Prescott, my parents will lose everything they've worked for." Jake stepped closer, his voice dropping to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "Meet me tomorrow at the old mission ruins outside town, noon. I have an idea, but I need time to work out the details." "The mission ruins," Hannah whispered. "I can't just please," Jake interrupted. "Trust me." "I think I can help, but you have to be willing to take a risk." Hannah hesitated. Meeting a man she barely knew alone went against everything she'd been taught about proper behavior. Yet the alternative, resigning herself to a loveless marriage with Emmett Prescott, seemed unbearable. "All right," she finally agreed. "Noon tomorrow." Jake's relief was palpable. He reached out and briefly touched her hand, a gesture so fleeting it could have been imagined. "Thank you, I promise I only want to help." With that, he mounted Thunder and rode away, his silhouette gradually fading into the gathering dusk. Hannah stood watching long after he had disappeared from sight, her heart filled with equal measures of hope and fear. The next morning, Hannah found it difficult to concentrate on her chores. Her mind kept wandering to thoughts of Jake Vance and their planned meeting. What idea did he have that could possibly save her from marriage to Prescott, and why was he willing to help her, a woman he barely knew? "You're distracted today," Alina observed as they worked together in the kitchen, preparing preserves from the last of the previous year's fruit. "Is something troubling you?" Hannah forced a smile. "Just thinking about the future, Mother." Alina's expression softened. "I know this arrangement with Mr. Prescott isn't what you dreamed of, Hannah, but in time you might find happiness with him." "Did you know him well before he approached Father?" Hannah asked, careful to keep her tone neutral. "Not well," Alina admitted. "He's always been cordial when we've had business at the bank, and his first wife, God rest her soul, was known to be content." This was news to Hannah. "I didn't realize he'd been married before." "Yes, to a woman from back east. She died some years ago, fever, I believe. They had no children." Alina paused in her work, studying her daughter. "Hannah, I hope you understand that your father and I wouldn't have agreed to this if we saw any other way forward." Hannah felt a surge of guilt. Her parents were doing what they thought best for the family. "I know, Mother. I'm trying to accept it." As noon approached, Hannah made an excuse about gathering herbs from the hills beyond the farm. Alina seemed suspicious but didn't prevent her from going. Hannah saddled her mare, Daisy, and rode toward the old mission ruins, her stomach tight with nervousness. The mission had been abandoned decades earlier, after conflicts with local tribes had made the area too dangerous for the Spanish missionaries. Now only stone walls remained, slowly crumbling back into the earth from which they'd been raised. The site was about a mile from the main road, hidden from view by a stand of ancient cottonwoods and surrounded by the scrubby vegetation that dominated the landscape. As Hannah approached, she saw Jake's buckskin hitched in the shade. Jake himself was sitting on a fallen column, hat beside him, staring thoughtfully at the distant mountains. He stood when he heard her approach. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I said I would," Hannah replied, dismounting and tying Daisy next to Thunder. "Though I'm still not sure what you think can be done about my situation." Jake gestured for her to sit on the column he'd just vacated, then settled himself on a nearby stone. "I've been making inquiries around town," he began, discreetly of course. "About what?" "About Prescott." "And about your family's debt." Jake's expression was serious. "Hannah, I believe Prescott deliberately engineered this situation." Hannah frowned. "What do you mean?" "Your father's loan, the terms were unusually harsh, higher interest than normal, stricter penalties for late payment." Jake leaned forward. "And according to the Land Records Office, Prescott has been buying up all the properties surrounding your farm for the past year." "But why would he do that?" Hannah asked, confusion evident in her voice. "Water rights," Jake replied simply. "Your farm has the only reliable spring in the area. In a drought like this, that makes your land extremely valuable." Hannah's mind raced as she processed this information. "You think he wants our farm for the water, but why not just foreclose when we couldn't pay?" "Because foreclosure would be public, messy, it might turn the town against him." Jake's eyes held hers. "But if he marries you, he gets the land, the water rights, and maintains his reputation as a benevolent community leader who saved a struggling family." Hannah felt sick as the pieces fell into place. "And he gets me as well," she whispered. Jake's jaw tightened. "Yes, that too. Even if you're right," Hannah said after a moment, "it doesn't change anything. The debt is real and we can't pay it." "What if you could?" Jake asked. "What if there was a way to settle the debt without you having to marry Prescott?" Hope flared briefly in Hannah's chest before reality tamped it down. "How? We don't have the money, and we won't unless the drought breaks and we have a successful harvest." Jake stood and paced a few steps, his boots stirring up small clouds of dust. "I have some savings," he said. "Not enough to cover the entire debt, but a substantial portion." Hannah stared at him in disbelief. "You would lend money to strangers. Why?" Jake turned to face her, his expression intense. "Because no one helped my sister when she needed it, because what Prescott is doing is wrong." He paused, then added more softly, "And because from the moment I saw you in that bank, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you." Hannah felt her heart skip at his words. "Mr. Vance, Jake, I don't know what to say. It's an incredibly generous offer, but even with your help, we'd still be short." "I've been thinking about that," Jake replied. "Your farm's main problem is the drought, right? Without rain, the crops fail and you can't make payments." Hannah nodded. "That's right, we've had barely any rainfall for over a year." "But you mentioned you have a spring," Jake continued. "Could it be used for irrigation?" "The spring is small," Hannah explained. "It's enough for household use and to water the animals, but not enough to irrigate the fields. My father tried to expand it last year, but the work was too much for him alone." Jake's eyes lit up. "What if you had help? What if we could expand the spring, create a proper irrigation system?" "In 3 weeks," Hannah asked skeptically. "Before my father returns." "It would be a challenge," Jake admitted. "But not impossible with enough hands, and a working irrigation system would make your farm viable again, drought or no drought." Hannah tried to temper the hope rising within her. "Even if we could do that, we'd still need to pay Prescott what we owe him now." "I told you, I have savings," Jake said, "and I'm betting there are people in town who'd be willing to contribute if they knew the truth about Prescott's scheme." "Why would they help us?" "Because not everyone in Silver Creek is fond of Prescott," Jake explained. "He may be the richest man around, but he's made enemies with his business practices. The general store owner, the blacksmith, the saloon keeper, they've all had run-ins with him." Hannah considered his words. It was true that Prescott had a reputation for driving hard bargains and showing little mercy to those who crossed him. But would that be enough for people to actually stand against him? It's a risk, Jake acknowledged, reading her doubts. But isn't it better than resigning yourself to a lifetime with a man who sees you as nothing more than a convenient acquisition? Put that way, Hannah could hardly disagree. What exactly are you proposing we do? Jake's plan, as he outlined it, was audacious. First, they would approach trusted members of the community for support, both financial and physical labor. They would work day and night to expand the spring and create a simple but effective irrigation system for the Johnson farm. Meanwhile, Jake would use his savings and whatever they could raise to make a substantial payment on the debt, enough to buy time until the farm could become profitable again. And if Prescott refuses to accept partial payment, Hannah asked, if he insists on the wedding? Jake's expression darkened. Then we expose his scheme to the entire town, make it clear he manipulated your family's misfortune for his own gain. That's a dangerous game, Hannah warned. Prescott is powerful. He could make life difficult for everyone involved. Some things are worth the risk, Jake said softly, his eyes holding hers. Your freedom is one of them. Hannah felt a rush of emotions, gratitude, hope, and something else she wasn't ready to name. Why are you really doing this, Jake? The truth. Jake was silent for a long moment. When I rode into Silver Creek, I was just passing through. Another town, another opportunity to make some money and move on. He looked up at the ruins around them. Then I saw you in that bank, standing up to Prescott with your chin raised and fire in your eyes, and something changed. Changed how? Hannah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know exactly, Jake admitted. I just know I can't ride away and leave you to that fate, not when there might be something I can do to help. Hannah studied his face, searching for any sign of deception, but found only sincerity. All right, she said finally. Let's try your plan, but we need to be careful if Prescott suspects what we're doing before we're ready. He won't, Jake assured her. We'll be discreet. Start with people we can trust. As they prepared to leave the ruins, Jake reached out and briefly took Hannah's hand. Thank you for trusting me. The simple touch sent a tremor through Hannah that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the man standing before her. Don't make me regret it, she replied, attempting lightness despite the gravity of their situation. Jake's answering smile was warm enough to chase away the lingering chill of her impending marriage. I won't, I promise. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of secret meetings and careful planning. Jake approached those in town who had grievances against Prescott, while Hannah spoke with neighboring farmers who relied on her family's spring during particularly dry spells. To her surprise, support materialized more readily than she had dared hope. Mr. Turner from the general store offered credit for supplies. The blacksmith, a burly man named Ferguson, volunteered his services and those of his 2 grown sons. Even Sheriff Daniels, while maintaining official neutrality, hinted that he wouldn't look too closely at their activities as long as no laws were broken. 5 days after their meeting at the Mission Ruins, work began on the Johnson farm. Men arrived before dawn, tools in hand, ready to expand the spring and dig irrigation channels. Women from neighboring homesteads brought food for the workers and helped Alina with household tasks so Hannah could focus on the project. Jake was everywhere at once, directing the dig at the spring, designing the layout of the channels, negotiating with suppliers for pipes and lumber. His knowledge of water management, gained from years working on ranches across the West, proved invaluable. Hannah worked alongside him, her skin browning under the relentless sun, her hands developing calluses from shoveling and carrying. They rarely had moments alone, but when their eyes met across the busy worksite, something unspoken passed between them, a growing connection that transcended their shared purpose. One evening, as the sun was setting and the day's workers had departed, Hannah found Jake alone by the partially completed main channel, making calculations in a small notebook. You should rest, she said, offering him a cup of water. You've been working since before sunrise. Jake accepted the water gratefully. We don't have much time. Your father returns in less than 2 weeks now. Hannah sat beside him on the edge of the channel, The work is progressing faster than I expected. Everyone has been so generous with their time. People respect your family, Jake replied, and they're not fond of seeing Prescott get everything he wants. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the setting sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. "What will you do?" Hannah asked suddenly. "After this is finished, I mean," Jake studied her face in the fading light. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether there's a reason for me to stay," he said quietly. Hannah's heart quickened at his words, but before she could respond, Eleanor called from the house, announcing that supper was ready. The next day brought an unexpected complication. Emmett Prescott himself rode out to the Johnson farm, ostensibly to call on Hannah. When he arrived, he found a dozen men digging channels across the property and Jake directing operations from the expanded spring. Hannah was helping a group of women prepare the midday meal when she saw Prescott's buggy approaching. "He's here," she said to no one in particular, her voice tight with anxiety. Jake, alerted by her tone, looked up from his work. Seeing Prescott, he quickly handed his shovel to another man and made his way to Hannah's side. "Let me handle this," he said quietly. "No," Hannah replied, straightening her shoulders. "This is my fight too." Together, they walked to meet Prescott as he pulled his buggy to a stop in the yard. The banker's expression was a mixture of surprise and suspicion as he surveyed the activity around the farm. "Miss Johnson," he greeted her, his tone carefully neutral. "I see you have quite the operation underway here." "Mr. Prescott," Hannah replied with forced politeness. "What brings you out to our farm today?" Prescott's eyes moved from Hannah to Jake, narrowing slightly. "I had hoped to discuss wedding arrangements with you. Your father returns in 10 days and there is much to prepare." "As you can see," Hannah said, gesturing to the busy scene around them, "we're in the middle of some improvements to the farm." "So I observe," Prescott replied. His gaze settled on Jake. "Mr. Vance, I wasn't aware you had an interest in agricultural engineering." Jake's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I have many interests, Mr. Prescott. Helping good people in difficult circumstances is one of them." Prescott stepped closer, lowering his voice. "What exactly is going on here, Miss Johnson? This looks like more than simple farm maintenance." Hannah took a deep breath. "We're installing an irrigation system, Mr. Prescott. With the spring expanded, we'll be able to water our crops regardless of rainfall." "I see," Prescott said slowly. "And may I ask how you're financing this project? Your family's financial situation is precarious, as you well know." "We have friends," Hannah replied simply. "People willing to help." "People willing to interfere, you mean," Prescott said, his mask of civility slipping slightly. He turned to Jake. "Mr. Vance, I'm curious about your involvement here. You arrived in Silver Creek barely a week ago, ostensibly to purchase cattle. Yet here you are, investing what appears to be significant time and resources in the Johnson farm." Jake met Prescott's gaze steadily. "Miss Johnson's situation moved me. I've seen too many people lose their land because of circumstances beyond their control." "How philanthropic," Prescott remarked dryly. "And completely coincidental, I'm sure, that the beneficiary of your charity happens to be a beautiful young woman." Hannah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Mr. Prescott, that's uncalled for." Prescott ignored her protest, his attention still fixed on Jake. "Whatever game you're playing, Vance, I suggest you consider carefully. The Johnson family owes me a significant sum. That debt will be settled one way or another." "We're well aware of the debt," Jake replied evenly. "In fact, I've been meaning to speak with you about that. With the improvements we're making, the farm will be profitable again. Hannah's family can repay you properly without the need for alternative arrangements." Prescott's smile was cold. "Our arrangement is not open to renegotiation, Mr. Vance. I have a signed agreement with Mr. Johnson." "An agreement made under duress," Jake countered, "because you deliberately set terms you knew they couldn't meet." Prescott's expression hardened. "Be careful with your accusations, Mr. Vance. Slander is a serious matter." "It's not slander if it's true," Jake replied. "We know about the water rights, Prescott. We know you've been buying up all the surrounding land. You engineered this situation to force Hannah into marriage because it was the cleanest way to get control of the spring." A tense silence fell between them. Around the farm, work had slowed as people noticed the confrontation taking place in the yard. "Miss Johnson," Prescott said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger, "I suggest you consider very carefully the path you're choosing. Your father made a commitment on your behalf. Failing to honor that commitment would have serious consequences for your family. Are you threatening her?" Jake asked, stepping forward. Hannah placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Mr. Prescott, I understand my family's obligations, but surely you can see that with a functioning farm we can repay the loan properly. Isn't that preferable to a marriage neither of us truly wants?" Prescott studied her for a long moment. "You're mistaken if you think I don't want this marriage, Hannah. I've been watching you for some time. You would make an excellent wife, young, beautiful, spirited. The financial arrangements with your father were simply a convenient way to secure what I already desired." His frank admission sent a chill through Hannah. The calculation in his eyes made it clear he viewed her as another acquisition, no different from the properties he collected. "Well, she's not for sale," Jake said, his voice low and dangerous. "And she's not going to be forced into marrying you." Prescott turned to him with a sneer. "And who will stop me? You, a drifter with no standing in this community." He looked back at Hannah. "Think about what you're doing, my dear. This man will be gone in a month, leaving you with nothing but broken promises. I offer security, position, a future." "A future as your possession," Hannah replied, finding her voice. "No thank you, Mr. Prescott. I'd rather take my chances with freedom." Prescott's face darkened. "Very well, since reason doesn't seem to be working, perhaps more direct measures are required." He straightened his jacket. "The full amount of your family's debt is due in 10 days, Miss Johnson. Either you honor the arrangement made with your father, or I will foreclose on this property immediately upon his return." With that, he climbed back into his buggy and snapped the reins, sending his horse trotting down the drive. A heavy silence fell as they watched him go. Finally, Jake turned to Hannah. "Are you all right?" Hannah realized she was trembling, whether from fear or anger she couldn't tell. "He's not going to let this go, is he?" "No," Jake admitted, "but neither are we." Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the work crew and into town. By nightfall, everyone in Silver Creek knew that Hannah Johnson was defying Emmett Prescott with the help of the mysterious cowboy who had recently arrived. The next morning, more volunteers showed up at the Johnson farm than ever before. Some brought supplies, others offered labor, and a few quietly pressed money into Jake's hands, small contributions toward paying off the debt. "I never expected this," Hannah said to Jake as they watched 3 wagons loaded with pipe and lumber pull into the yard. "These people barely know us." "They know enough," Jake replied, "and they've known Prescott a lot longer. This isn't just about your farm anymore, Hannah. It's about standing up to a man who's bullied this town for years." The work continued at a feverish pace. The spring was fully excavated and lined with stone to prevent collapse. Channels radiated outward to the fields, with gates to control the flow of water. A simple pump system, designed by Jake and built by the blacksmith, would help distribute water to the higher ground. 8 days before Mr. Johnson's expected return, the system was ready for testing. A crowd gathered to watch as Jake and Hannah opened the main gate, sending water flowing through the primary channel. "Moment of truth," Jake murmured as the water rushed forward. They followed its progress, watching anxiously for leaks or collapses in the channel walls. The water flowed true, spreading through the network of smaller channels just as Jake had designed. A cheer went up from the assembled crowd as the farthest field began to receive its share of the life-giving moisture. "It works," Hannah exclaimed, impulsively throwing her arms around Jake's neck. He caught her in a fierce embrace, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around once before setting her down again. "Was there ever any doubt?" he asked with a grin, though the relief in his eyes belied his confident words. That evening, after the celebration had died down and most people had returned to town, Jake and Hannah sat on the porch of the Johnson house, watching as twilight settled over the newly irrigated fields. "We still have to deal with Prescott," Hannah said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. The irrigation system is wonderful, but it doesn't solve our immediate problem. Jake nodded. I've been keeping track of the contributions. With my savings added, we have about $300. Still 200 short, Hannah sighed. And Prescott made it clear he won't accept partial payment. Maybe not from us, Jake agreed, but what about from your father? Hannah looked at him questioningly. My father won't be back for another week, and even then he won't have the money. What if we send for him? Jake suggested. Telegraph him to return early. If he's here, he can negotiate with Prescott directly. With the irrigation system in place and partial payment ready, he'd be in a much stronger position. Hope flared in Hannah's chest. Do you think it would work? It's worth trying, Jake replied. Prescott's arrangement was with your father, not with you. And your father might have more influence with him than we do. The next morning, Jake rode into town to send a telegram to Hannah's father, explaining the situation in as few words as the medium allowed and urging his immediate return. While there, he also visited the land office again, examining records of Prescott's property acquisitions and water rights claims. What he discovered confirmed his suspicions. Prescott had been systematically buying properties throughout the valley, focusing particularly on those with access to water. The Johnson Spring was one of the few reliable water sources. He didn't control a gap in his monopoly that he clearly intended to fill, one way or another. As Jake left the land office, he nearly collided with Sheriff Daniels on the boardwalk. Vance, the sheriff greeted him. Been meaning to have a word with you. Jake tensed, wondering if Prescott had somehow convinced the law to move against him. What about Sheriff? Daniels glanced up and down the street before speaking. Prescott's been making inquiries about you, sent telegrams to several towns you mentioned passing through. I've got nothing to hide, Jake said carefully. Good to hear, Daniels replied, because he's determined to find something. Man like that doesn't take kindly to being crossed. He paused, especially over a woman. Jake's jaw tightened. Hannah Johnson isn't Prescott's property. Never said she was, the sheriff countered. Just warning you to watch your back. Prescott plays by his own rules in this town. Appreciated, Jake said, but I'm not backing down. Daniels studied him for a moment. No, I don't reckon you are. Just be careful and keep that temper of yours in check. I'd hate to have to lock you up when you're doing good work out at the Johnson place. Jake nodded his understanding and continued down the street. As he approached the telegraph office, he noticed two of Prescott's ranch hands watching him from across the way. Their posture was casual, but their attention was unmistakably focused on him. The message to Hannah's father sent, Jake mounted Thunder and rode back to the Johnson farm at a canter, an uneasy feeling settling between his shoulder blades. Prescott was making moves of his own, and Jake suspected things would get worse before they got better. Hannah was working in the newly irrigated fields when he returned, helping to plant a late crop of vegetables that might yet produce before the first frost. She straightened as he approached, pushing back the brim of her hat to shield her eyes from the sun. Did you send the telegram? She asked as he dismounted. Jake nodded, and visited the land office. Prescott's been busy these past few years buying up water rights all over the county. He glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. The sheriff says Prescott's asking questions about me. Trying to dig up something he can use. Hannah's expression grew worried. Will he find anything? Nothing that would matter to decent folks, Jake replied, but Prescott isn't above twisting the truth to serve his purposes. As they walked back toward the house, Jake explained what he'd learned from the land records and his encounter with Sheriff Daniels. Hannah listened intently, her brow furrowed in concern. Jake, she said when he'd finished, maybe you should leave. Go somewhere Prescott can't reach you. This isn't your fight. Jake stopped walking and turned to face her. Is that what you want, for me to leave? Hannah couldn't meet his eyes. No, she admitted softly, but I don't want you hurt because of me. Jake reached out and gently tilted her chin up, forcing her to look at him. Hannah Johnson, I'm exactly where I want to be, and I'm not going anywhere until this is settled. The intensity in his gaze made Hannah's breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and she wasn't sure whether to be disappointed or relieved when he didn't. Besides, Jake added with a slight smile, dropping his hand. "Your father should be here in a few days if he leaves immediately after receiving the telegram. Once he arrives, we can confront Prescott together." The next day brought an unexpected visitor to the Johnson farm. Mrs. Sarah Peterson, the widow who had been one of Hannah's regular customers for eggs and butter, arrived in her small buggy, looking nervous but determined. "Mrs. Peterson," Hannah greeted her, surprised. "What brings you out here today?" The older woman glanced around before speaking. "I heard about your trouble with Mr. Prescott, dear, and about what you and Mr. Vance are trying to do." Hannah nodded cautiously. "News travels fast in Silver Creek." "Indeed it does," Mrs. Peterson agreed. She reached into her reticule and withdrew a small pouch. "I want to contribute to your fund. It's not much, just $50, but it might help." Hannah stared at the pouch in shock. "Mrs. Peterson, that's incredibly generous, but I can't accept, please," the widow interrupted. "My husband owed his position as bank manager to Mr. Prescott. For years, I watched him carry out orders that went against his conscience, foreclosing on families who needed just a little more time, denying loans to good people, because Prescott had his eye on their land." Her expression hardened. "When Thomas died, Prescott dismissed me from the bank house with barely a week's notice. That man has no heart, Hannah. I won't see another young woman's life ruined by him." Deeply moved, Hannah accepted the pouch. "Thank you. This brings us much closer to what we need." Mrs. Peterson squeezed her hand. "There are others in town who feel as I do. Mr. Prescott may be powerful, but he's not as well liked as he believes." After the widow left, Hannah sought out Jake, who was working with a group of men to strengthen one of the secondary irrigation channels. "Mrs. Peterson just gave us $50, she told him quietly, showing him the pouch. Jake's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That's generous of her." "She said Prescott forced her out of the bank house after her husband died," Hannah explained. "And that others in town might feel the same way about him." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "With her contribution, we're only $150 short now. If a few more people step forward, we might actually be able to pay him off," Hannah finished, hope rising in her voice. That afternoon, another unexpected ally emerged. The saloon keeper, a gruff man named Hargrove who rarely involved himself in town affairs, rode out to the farm with his own contribution. "Heard you're standing up to Prescott," he said without preamble, handing Jake a small sack of coins. "About time someone did. There's $75 there, use it well." Before Jake could properly thank him, Hargrove had remounted and ridden away, clearly uncomfortable with displays of gratitude. "That leaves us only $75 short," Jake said to Hannah later as they tallied their growing fund. "Your father's telegram could arrive any day now. Things are finally looking up," but their optimism was premature. The next morning, 2 of Prescott's men arrived at the farm with a written notice. Prescott was calling in the loan immediately, citing a clause in the agreement that allowed him to demand full payment if the property was significantly altered without the bank's approval. "The irrigation system," Hannah realized as she read the notice. "He's using it against us." "He can't do that," Jake argued. "The improvements increase the value of the property. No court would uphold this." "But by the time we could fight it in court, the damage would be done," Hannah pointed out. "He's forcing our hand." According to the notice, they had 48 hours to pay the full amount or face immediate foreclosure. "We need that last $75, Jake said grimly. "And we need your father here now." They sent another urgent telegram, then Jake rode into town to speak with Sheriff Daniels about the legality of Prescott's notice. The sheriff, while sympathetic, could offer little help. The agreement was properly signed, he explained. "And that clause about property alterations is standard in Prescott's contracts. He's acting within his legal rights, even if it's a dirty trick." Frustrated, Jake visited several other townspeople who had expressed support for their cause, explaining the urgent need for the final portion of the debt. By evening, he had secured promises for another $40, still leaving them short. As he prepared to return to the farm, Jake was approached by a man he recognized as one of Prescott's ranch foremen. "Vance," the man called, stepping out from between 2 buildings. "Need to talk to you." Jake's hand instinctively moved closer to his sidearm. What about? Prescott wants to make you an offer, the foreman said. $500 cash if you ride out tonight and don't come back. Jake stared at him in disbelief. He's trying to buy me off, the foreman shrugged. He figures without you stirring up trouble, the Johnson girl will come to her senses. $500 is a lot of money, more than enough to start that cattle operation you claim to want. You can tell Prescott to keep his money, Jake replied coldly. I'm not for sale. The foreman's expression hardened. Don't be a fool, Vance. You're fighting a losing battle. Prescott always gets what he wants in the end. Not this time, Jake said, turning to Mount Thunder. This doesn't end well for you, the foreman called after him. Prescott knows about Fort Smith. Jake froze, then slowly turned back. What did you say? Fort Smith, Arkansas, 1874. A man named Jake Vance was wanted for questioning in connection with the death of a cattle baron. The foreman's smile was unpleasant. Ring any bells? Jake's expression remained impassive, but inwardly he cursed. That was settled long ago. The real killer confessed. Maybe, the foreman acknowledged, but mud sticks, doesn't it? Especially out here where a man's reputation is all he has. How do you think Hannah Johnson would feel about a man once accused of murder? How do you think her father will react when he hears? Is that Prescott's game? Jake asked, anger rising. Slander and threats. It's just business, the foreman replied. $500 tonight. Or tomorrow, everyone in Silver Creek hears about Fort Smith. After the man left, Jake stood motionless, weighing his options. The incident at Fort Smith had indeed been resolved. The actual culprit had confessed on his deathbed a year later, but the story could still damage his standing in Silver Creek. More importantly, it could make Hannah doubt him at a critical moment. The ride back to the Johnson farm gave Jake time to think. By the time he arrived, he had made his decision. He would tell Hannah about Fort Smith himself before Prescott could use it against him. He found her on the porch, watching the sunset paint the newly irrigated fields in golden light. She smiled when she saw him, and the simple gesture strengthened his resolve. Whatever happened, he wouldn't let Prescott win. Any luck in town? Hannah asked as he joined her on the porch step. Some, Jake replied. We've got promises for another $40, still short though. Hannah sighed. Mother found another $25 in her emergency funds. That leaves us only $10 away. We'll find it, Jake assured her. But Hannah, there's something I need to tell you, something about my past that Prescott might try to use against me. Her expression grew concerned. What is it? Jake took a deep breath and told her about Fort Smith, how he had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, accused of a murder he didn't commit, and eventually cleared when the true killer confessed. He explained how he had been passing through town when a prominent cattle baron was found dead, and how circumstances had made him the primary suspect until evidence pointed elsewhere. I was cleared completely, he finished. But Prescott has somehow learned about it, and he's threatening to spread the story around town if I don't leave Silver Creek tonight. Hannah had listened without interruption, her face thoughtful. And will you leave? Jake met her eyes steadily. That depends on you. If you believe me, if you trust me, then know I'm staying right here until this is finished. But if you have any doubts. I don't, Hannah said firmly. I trust you, Jake, and I won't let Prescott drive you away with threats and lies. Relief washed over him. Thank you, he said simply. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Jake, Hannah said finally, her voice soft. What happens after, if we manage to pay Prescott, if my father returns and everything works out? What then? Jake turned to look at her, really look at her, the delicate curve of her cheek, the determination in her eyes, the strength that had drawn him to her from the first moment. I meant what I said before, he replied. I'll stay if there's a reason to stay. Hannah met his gaze. And if I want you to stay, if that's reason enough, Jake's heart hammered in his chest. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned closer. Then wild horses couldn't drag me from Silver Creek. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered in the gathering dusk. When they finally parted, Hannah's eyes were shining with something Jake dared to believe might be love. We should go inside, she whispered. Mother will be wondering where we are." Jake nodded, rising and offering her his hand. As she took it, he felt a certainty he had never known before. Whatever Prescott might do, whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with Hannah at his side. The next morning brought unexpected news. A telegram arrived for Hannah from her father. He had departed immediately upon receiving their first message and expected to reach Silver Creek by nightfall, a full day earlier than they had hoped. "This changes everything," Hannah said excitedly as she read the telegram to Jake and her mother. "With Father here, we can confront Prescott together. We're still short on the payment," Jake reminded her, "but only by $10 now." Eleanor Johnson, who had been quietly supportive of their efforts despite her initial reservations, spoke up. "I have my mother's cameo brooch. It's not worth much, but Mr. Wilson at the pawn shop might give $10 for it." Hannah shook her head firmly. "No, Mother, that's your most treasured possession. We'll find another way." Jake, who had been thinking deeply, made a decision. "I have something that might bring $10 or more. My father's pocket watch. It's silver with an inscription." "Jake, no," Hannah protested. "That's a family heirloom, and I'd rather part with it than see you forced into marriage with Prescott," Jake replied. "Besides, we can redeem it later when the farm is producing again." With that settled, they prepared for Mr. Johnson's arrival. Jake rode into town to pawn his watch, returning with $15 more than enough to complete their payment. By late afternoon, they had the full $500 ready. As dusk approached, Hannah grew increasingly anxious, pacing the porch and scanning the road for any sign of her father's return. Jake stood nearby, his own tension evident in the set of his shoulders. What if something happened? Hannah worried aloud. What if he was delayed? "The telegram said he'd be here tonight," Jake reassured her. "There's still time." Just as the last light was fading from the sky, they heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Hannah's face lit up as she recognized her father's team of horses pulling around the bend in the road. Thomas Johnson was a man in his early 50s, with the weathered face of someone who had spent his life working outdoors. He looked weary from his journey but alert as he pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard. Hannah ran to him, throwing her arms around him as he climbed down. "Father, thank God you're here." Thomas hugged his daughter tightly, then greeted his wife with equal warmth before turning his attention to Jake, who had approached more slowly. "You must be Vance," he said, extending his hand. "Your telegrams were quite alarming." Jake shook the offered hand firmly. "Mr. Johnson, I'm glad you made it in time." Inside the house, over a hastily prepared meal, they explained everything that had happened: the irrigation system, the contributions from townspeople, Prescott's manipulation of the loan terms, and his ultimatum. Thomas Johnson listened gravely, his expression darkening as the full picture emerged. "I never should have agreed to his terms," he said when they had finished, "but the drought had left us desperate, and Prescott seemed to be offering a solution." "He deliberately set you up to fail," Jake pointed out. "The interest rates, the penalties, the clause about property alterations, it was all designed to force a default." "And to pressure Hannah into marriage," Eleanor added, her earlier doubts about defying Prescott now completely gone. Thomas reached across the table to take his daughter's hand. "I'm so sorry, Hannah. I thought I was securing your future, not selling it." Hannah squeezed his hand. "You did what you thought was best, Father, but now we have a chance to fix this. We have the full payment ready. And a working irrigation system that will make the farm profitable again," Jake added. Thomas looked thoughtful. "Prescott won't be easily dissuaded. He's used to getting his way in this county." "We have until noon tomorrow to pay the debt in full," Hannah reminded him. "If we go together, all of us, he'll have to accept it, the money and the end of any arrangement involving me." "Very well," Thomas agreed. "Tomorrow morning we'll confront Prescott together." That night, after her parents had retired, Hannah found Jake sitting on the porch steps, staring up at the star-filled sky. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, settling beside him. Jake shook his head. "Too much on my mind." "Having second thoughts?" Hannah asked, a note of uncertainty in her voice. Jake turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Not about you, never about you." He took her hand gently. "But I am concerned about tomorrow. Prescott won't give up easily, even with the full payment." "We have the law on our side now," Hannah reminded him. "He can't refuse legal tender for a debt." "The law isn't always enough out here," Jake replied. "Men like Prescott find ways around it." They sat in silence for a moment, their hands still joined. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Hannah said finally, "I want you to know that I'm grateful. Not just for the help with the farm and the debt, but for—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "For showing me that I have choices, that I don't have to accept the future someone else has planned for me." Jake lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "You would have found your way without me, Hannah Johnson. You're the strongest person I've ever met." Hannah's heart swelled at his words. "Stay," she whispered. "When this is over, stay here with me." Jake's answer was in his kiss, tender at first, then deepening with a passion that made Hannah's head spin. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "Wild horses," he reminded her softly, "couldn't drag me away." The next morning, the Johnson family and Jake rode into Silver Creek together. The full amount of the debt, $500 in banknotes and coins, was securely tucked in Thomas Johnson's jacket pocket. They headed directly to the Prescott Bank and Investment Company, determined to settle the matter once and for all. The young clerk looked up in surprise as the four of them entered. "Mr. Johnson, we weren't expecting you back for several more days." "I returned early," Thomas replied tersely. "We need to see Mr. Prescott immediately." The clerk hesitated. "He's in a meeting, but it's all right, Phillips," Prescott's voice called from the open door of his office. "I'll see the Johnsons now." His gaze swept over the group, lingering on Jake with obvious displeasure. All of them. They filed into Prescott's office, which seemed smaller with all five of them inside. Prescott returned to his seat behind the desk, leaving them to stand before him like supplicants. "Well, Thomas," he said, leaning back in his chair, "this is an unexpected development. I understood you were settling your brother's estate back east." "I was," Thomas confirmed, "until I received urgent telegrams about your attempt to foreclose on my property and force my daughter into marriage." Prescott's smile was thin. Hardly force. "It was an arrangement we both agreed would benefit all parties." "An arrangement made under false pretenses," Thomas countered. "You deliberately set loan terms you knew we couldn't meet, all to gain control of our water rights." "That's a serious accusation," Prescott said, his voice hardening. "Do you have proof?" "We know you've been buying up all the surrounding properties," Hannah interjected. "We've seen the land records. Our spring is the only reliable water source in the area that you don't control." Prescott's gaze shifted to her. "Business strategy is hardly criminal, my dear. Water is valuable in this territory. Surely you understand that better than most." "What I understand," Hannah replied, "is that you manipulated my family's misfortune for your own gain." Prescott sighed, as if dealing with unreasonable children. "This conversation is becoming tedious. The fact remains that your family owes me $500, due by noon today. Otherwise, foreclosure proceedings begin immediately." Thomas stepped forward and placed a stack of banknotes on Prescott's desk. $500 in full, the debt is paid." Prescott stared at the money, his expression unchanging. "Where did you get this?" "From honest people," Jake spoke up. "People who'd rather see a hard-working family keep their land than watch you add another property to your collection." Prescott's eyes narrowed as he looked at Jake. "I offered you $500 to leave town, Vance. You could have started your own ranch free and clear. Instead, you chose to meddle in affairs that don't concern you." "They concern me now," Jake replied steadily. Prescott turned his attention back to Thomas. "The deadline for payment was noon. It's only 10 o'clock. I'll need time to verify that these funds are legitimate." "You can count it right now," Thomas insisted. "It's all there." "Nevertheless," Prescott said smoothly, "proper banking procedures must be followed. Return at noon, and if everything is in order, I'll provide a receipt indicating the loan has been satisfied." Jake recognized the delay tactic for what it was. "We're not leaving the money without a receipt," he said firmly. "Count it now in our presence and provide written confirmation that the debt is paid in full." Prescott's mask of civility slipped, revealing the anger beneath. "You forget yourself, Vance. This is between me and the Johnsons. You're nothing but a drifter with a questionable past." "A past you tried to use against me," Jake countered. "But it didn't work. I told Hannah everything about Fort Smith. Your threats have no power here." Prescott's eyes darted to Hannah, who met his gaze unflinchingly. "You believe him, a man accused of murder." "A man wrongfully accused and later cleared," Hannah corrected. "Yes, I believe him, more than I could ever believe you." The tension in the room was palpable. Finally, Prescott reached for the stack of money and began to count it methodically, his movements precise and controlled despite his obvious anger. When he had verified the full amount was present, he opened a ledger and made an entry. Then he wrote out a receipt, signed it with a flourish, and slid it across the desk. "The debt is paid," he said coldly, "but don't think this is over. Silver Creek is my town. Cross me again and you'll regret it, all of you." Thomas took the receipt, examining it carefully before tucking it into his pocket. "We're honest people paying an honest debt, Prescott. There's nothing more between us now. As for any arrangement regarding my daughter," Eleanor added, finding her voice, "consider it null and void. Hannah is free to make her own choices about her future." Prescott's gaze moved to Hannah, something dangerous flickering in his eyes. "Is that so? And what choice have you made, my dear? To throw yourself at a drifter who will be gone with the first winter's snow?" Before Hannah could respond, Jake stepped forward. "That's enough, Prescott. You've been paid. The matter is settled." "Is it?" Prescott asked softly. "A man's reputation is a fragile thing, Vance, especially out here. Fort Smith may be old news, but rumors have a way of spreading." "Threaten me all you want," Jake replied. "It won't change anything." Prescott's smile was cold. "We'll see." As they left the bank, Hannah felt as though a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The nightmare of forced marriage to Emmett Prescott was over. Her family's farm was secure. And Jake was still by her side, his hand warm and steady on her arm as they stepped out into the morning sunlight. But Prescott's parting threat lingered in the air, a reminder that their victory might come at a cost. Jake seemed to sense her concern. "Don't worry about Prescott," he said quietly as they walked toward the general store where Thomas and Eleanor had gone ahead to purchase supplies. "His power comes from fear. Now that people have stood up to him once, they'll find it easier to do so again." Hannah wanted to believe him, but she had lived in Silver Creek long enough to know that Emmett Prescott was not a man who forgave easily or forgot a slight. "What will you do now?" she asked, voicing the question that had been on her mind since their conversation on the porch the night before. Jake's expression softened as he looked at her. "I meant what I said, Hannah. I'm staying if you'll have me." "As what?" Hannah asked, needing to hear him say it. Jake stopped walking and turned to face her, heedless of the curious glances from passers-by. "As whatever you want me to be." "A partner, a friend," he paused, his eyes holding hers. "A husband someday if you'll have me." Hannah's heart soared at his words. "I would like that," she said softly, "very much." Their moment was interrupted by shouts from further down the street. Looking up, they saw a commotion outside the saloon. Sheriff Daniels was there, along with several townspeople gathered in a tense circle. "What's happening?" Hannah asked a woman hurrying past. "Fight at the saloon," the woman replied without slowing. "One of Prescott's men accused that new blacksmith's apprentice of cheating at cards. It's getting ugly." Jake frowned. "That's too convenient. A distraction right after our confrontation with Prescott." They hurried toward the saloon, arriving just as the sheriff was separating the two men. One was indeed the young apprentice who had recently started working for Ferguson, the blacksmith. The other was the same foreman who had approached Jake with Prescott's bribe. "He cheated," the foreman was shouting, his face red with anger or drink. "I caught him dealing from the bottom of the deck." "I did no such thing," the apprentice protested. "He's lying," Sheriff Daniels held them apart. "Enough, both of you cool down. No more gambling in my town for either of you." As the crowd began to disperse, Jake noticed Thomas and Eleanor emerging from the general store, looking concerned at the disturbance. "Everything all right?" Thomas asked as they approached. "Just a disagreement at the saloon," Jake replied. "Nothing serious." They were preparing to leave town when the sheriff approached them. Johnson, Vance a word. Thomas and Jake exchanged glances before stepping aside with Daniels. I heard you settled with Prescott, the sheriff said quietly. Paid him in full. Thomas nodded. That's right. Got the receipt right here. He patted his pocket. Good, Daniels said. That's good, but you should know Prescott's not the type to let things go. He's already been in my office, making noise about investigating where all that money came from so quickly. It was given freely by people in town, Jake said. Nothing illegal about that. I know, the sheriff agreed, but Prescott's suggesting otherwise, talking about conspiracy and interference with contracts, legal mumbo-jumbo that doesn't amount to much but could cause trouble. What kind of trouble? Thomas asked. Daniels shrugged. Hard to say. Prescott has connections, the territorial judge, the bank examiner, people who could make life difficult if he asked them to. So we should just wait for him to strike, Jake asked, frustration evident in his voice. No, Daniels replied thoughtfully. I think you should strike first, not with fists, he added quickly, seeing Jake's expression. With the truth. Tell people what really happened, how Prescott tried to manipulate the situation, how he threatened you, how the town came together to stop him. Make it public, Thomas realized, so he can't twist it later. Exactly, the sheriff nodded. Prescott's power comes from operating in the shadows, bring everything into the light. After thanking Daniels for his advice, they rejoined Hannah and Alina. Together, they decided on a course of action. They would host a gathering at the Johnson farm that evening, inviting everyone who had contributed to the fund or helped with the irrigation system. There, they would publicly thank their supporters and explain exactly what Prescott had attempted to do. Word spread quickly through town. By the time the Johnsons and Jake returned to the farm, several neighbors had already arrived, eager to hear that the debt had been paid and Prescott's scheme thwarted. Throughout the afternoon, more people came: farmers, shopkeepers, ranch hands, even Mrs. Peterson with her fresh baked pies. By early evening, the yard was filled with nearly half the population of Silver Creek, all celebrating what many were already calling a victory for the common folk against the town's most powerful man. Thomas Johnson stood on the porch steps and raised his hands for silence. When the crowd quieted, he spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the yard. Friends and neighbors, my family and I want to thank you for your extraordinary generosity. Thanks to you, our debt to the bank has been paid in full. He held up the receipt as proof, and a cheer went up from the assembled crowd. But more importantly, Thomas continued when the noise had died down, you helped us stand against a man who sought to use his power and wealth to take advantage of our misfortune, a man who attempted to force my daughter into a marriage she did not want, simply to gain control of our water rights. A murmur of anger rippled through the crowd at this blunt statement of what many had suspected, but few had dared to say aloud. Emmett Prescott has operated this way for years, Thomas went on. Using loans and mortgages as weapons, manipulating good people into impossible situations, then swooping in to claim their property when they inevitably default. But today, thanks to all of you, his plan failed. More cheers erupted, louder than before. When they subsided, Thomas gestured to Jake. I also want to thank this man, Jake Vance, who saw what was happening and chose to help strangers in need. Without his engineering knowledge, our irrigation system would never have been completed in time. Without his courage in standing up to Prescott, my daughter might now be facing a very different future. Jake, uncomfortable with the attention, nodded briefly in acknowledgement. His eyes sought Hannah's in the crowd, finding her smiling up at him with a warmth that made his heart skip. Finally, Thomas concluded, I want to make it clear that any threats or actions Prescott might take against those who helped us will be met with the united resistance of this community. We've shown today what we can accomplish when we stand together. Let's not forget that lesson. The celebration continued well into the night. Food and drink were shared, music played, and for the first time in months, Hannah felt truly happy. The nightmare of her arranged marriage was behind her. The farm would survive, and Jake was staying. As the party began to wind down, Hannah found Jake standing apart from the crowd, watching the festivities with a contented expression. "You did this," she said, coming to stand beside him. "You brought all these people together." Jake shook his head. They were already united in their dislike of Prescott. They just needed someone to show them they weren't alone in feeling that way. Hannah slipped her hand into his. "What happens now?" Jake squeezed her hand gently. "Now we finish planting those fields, get the farm back on solid footing. And then," he turned to face her fully, "and then, if you're still sure about me, we think about the future, our future." Hannah's heart swelled with emotion. "I am sure. I've never been more sure of anything." Jake's smile was tender as he bent to kiss her, heedless of the knowing glances and approving murmurs from the remaining guests. In that moment, with the stars shining above and the promise of tomorrow stretching out before them, Hannah knew she had found something far more precious than security or wealth. She had found love, freely given and freely returned. In the months that followed, life in Silver Creek gradually returned to normal, or rather, to a new normal. Emmett Prescott, his scheme exposed and his reputation damaged, found his influence in town significantly diminished. While he remained wealthy and powerful, people were no longer afraid to stand against him when necessary. The Johnson farm flourished under the new irrigation system. With water flowing to the fields regardless of rainfall, they were able to plant and harvest crops that others could not, turning their once struggling homestead into one of the most productive in the area. Jake stayed, as he had promised. He worked alongside Thomas, learning the ins and outs of farming while contributing his own knowledge of cattle and horses. In the evenings, he courted Hannah properly with her parents' blessing. They would sit on the porch after supper, talking about their days and their dreams, planning a future together. 6 months after the confrontation with Prescott, on a crisp autumn day with the mountains painted in red and gold, Jake and Hannah were married in the small church in Silver Creek. The entire town turned out for the celebration, which many saw as the final chapter in their victory over Prescott's tyranny. As Hannah stood beside Jake, speaking the vows that would bind them together, she remembered that terrible day when she had read her father's letter announcing her betrothal to Emmett Prescott. How different her life might have been if Jake Vance hadn't ridden into Silver Creek at precisely the right moment. How different it might have been if she hadn't found the courage to fight for her own future. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher said, beaming at the young couple. "You may kiss your bride." As Jake's lips met hers, sealing their vows with a kiss that promised a lifetime of love and partnership, Hannah silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought this man into her life. She was no longer a girl told she'd marry a man twice her age. She was Hannah Vance, married to the man she loved, ready to face whatever challenges the future might hold together. Years later, when their children asked how they met, Jake would always begin the story the same way. "Your mother was about to be forced into marrying a man she didn't love, and I told everyone who would listen, she's my bride, not his." And Hannah would laugh and correct him, saying, "That's not how it happened at all." But in her heart, she knew that from the moment they met, they had been destined for each other, two souls finding their way home across the wild, untamed landscape of the Arizona Territory.